Okay, so now we're gonna talk a little bit more. We're gonna transition from talking about hazards and start to. You're gonna do the transition soon, and we're gonna start to get a little bit into the space of risk. And as Ignacio alluded to this morning, what we were trying to accomplish with today was to hear less from the folks doing the research and more from the folks working on the actual implementation of these things. And so we have Stephen Gibbons from the Global Tsunami Model. He'll kick us off, and then Kara Giacomaci from FEMA, and then Ankit
Excellent
Dubey.
pronunciation. Nobody gets it right the first time. Wow.
And then I'm glad, thank you. And then Ankit Dubey from Eon is going to speak. Stephen, please, the floor is yours. Clicker right there. Forward, backwards, always backwards. I lost my copy.
My name is Stephen Gibbons. I work for the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute in Oslo. This talk is on behalf of or in collaboration with the Global Tsunami Model team. I also want to give acknowledgement to these European Union funded, that wasn't the intention. European Union funded projects, GEES, the Centre of Excellence for Exascale and the Solid Earth, GeoInquire and the European Plate Observing System, who have financed different components of the systems I want to talk about. Now, the entire purpose of this talk or this meeting is going from left to right of this bottom, going from hazard to risk. Diego was very brave in presenting the entire PTHA in 60 seconds, and I put it in a little 3 by 1 inch box. So the probability of exceeding a given inundation metric above a given threshold in at a given location in a given time interval. But even this little box consists of a whole chain of items that need modelling from the source, including its probabilities and return period and its physical characteristics, to the propagation, how it's modelled and projected, and the intensity measures and how it's made. I've been very careful to include all or many of the tsunamigenic sources here. Being in Cascadia, of course, the tsunami hazard at the coast is overwhelmingly dominated by the earthquake. So, but this isn't the case everywhere on the planet, and the landslide, volcano, and the meteorological or more generally the atmospherically driven tsunami is much more significant. So we also need to note that these sources do not necessarily happen in isolation. Many significant tsunamis are generated by the landslide induced by an earthquake in much greater degree than the earthquake itself. And events like Hunga Tonga probably included all 4 of these, and the contribution of each one can only be sort of worked out after many years of research. The propagation itself is not just a hydrological model, but the source. Do we include nonlinearity, Boussinesque, multi-layer dispersion or not? There are many items to consider here. And then the intensity itself, how we model it, going first from offshore height modeling and then statistical projections to inundation modeling, and then with what methods of simulating with friction, different models for friction. So in every single one of these boxes is a set of unknowns, uncertainties, and knowledge gaps. And I want to deal with how these will propagate all the way along this chart. So I want to introduce the global tsunami model. This came about from multi-institutional work for the UN disaster reduction project about 10 years ago. And it was realised that a collective effort was needed for a global hazard and risk in tsunami, and that an international competence centre was necessary. So the global tsunami model has as its mission saving lives and reducing losses, and increased dialogue and collaboration on tsunami hazard and risk. And with a mission involving community building, scientific products and services, and outreach and collaboration. And just give a sort of timeline, not necessary to consider all the points on here. For the first 5 or so years, it consists of regular meetings between different actors involved at meetings like AGU, the EGU, and the UNDDR, and supported by EU projects such as Tsunamis. And in recent years, it's been nearly all the product development and research has been guided within a round of EU-funded projects, which have largely been around high-performance computing or workflows. The CHEESE project, which is one I've been most involved with, is high-performance computing. But projects like DTGeo, digital twins for geophysical extremes, and eFlows for HPC, which is focused on workflows to execute on high-performance computing systems. This is a question I've already had about 4 times in the last day or so. What is the actual status of GTM? And it has existed as a legal entity formally for about 6 weeks now, so it's a very fresh position. It's in the form of a German eingetragener Verein, which is sort of a non-commercial entity. It's the same model that the European Geosciences Union has for sort of comparison reasons. There will be rounds of registration to fix a legal status, and the first General Assembly is projected to be at the next EGU General Assembly in April 2025. Now, many individuals and institutes have sent letters of interest over the past 10 years. These are all being contacted. The core of the GTM want to contact all of you, all of the global people involved in tsunami research for input, and they would want input from all of you. Now, I want to talk about the core products of GTM, which is both products and services. First is global and regional PTHA, with offshore hazard curves globally, but both regional and local scales. Workflows for PTH execution, which is an already existing product and a workflow that through other EU projects such as GeoInquire, we provide opportunities to come and work with us and operate and develop it for different case scenarios. It also has a goal of expert brokerage for example, untraditional tsunami sources such as landslide modelling. So, if in case scenarios, who should people go to? And it's the goal is this is a sort of global hub to connect experts. Within the auspices of the second phase of the CHEESE2, the CHEESE project, an update to the global tsunami hazard model is being formed. And this is both the flagship deliverable of the CHEESE project, and it's a flagship product of the GTM. And there are many characteristics of this model, such as we want a robust and updatable workflow, the GTM PTHA engine, with standardized output in collaboration with GEM. It wants interoperability both of the input and output, such that the output is useful from a GEM perspective. We want to include all the scientific goals, which are developments such as heterogeneous slip, which has been identified as being crucial, and interoperability also the probabilistic tsunami forecast to sort of urgent computing paradigm. I've put in grey text incorporation of tides and modelling of sea level rise, which are things that we realise are important, but they're not in the deliverable promised for the CHEESE project. But we realise that the model needs to be updatable and flexible to incorporate such things. So just to give an idea of the architecture of what the PTHA engine will look like, sort of a workflow to operate on the scales required, and on the computing resources available and required, so with global propagation and regional inundation. We want it to be quite agnostic to the scale and the detail of the source, so we can, it will have a standardized source input to represent from the simplest to the more complicated source mechanisms, and also the output to be either global or at very, very local scales. It's based on a workflow generated within the first generation of the CHEESE project, which is a developed and tested workflow for local PTHA. So there's very recognizable elements from first description of the available computational resources and the bathymetry, the geographical extent needed, and whichever user thresholds and hazard metrics the user requires. We need a basis hazard model. In this example is of the Mediterranean Sea, where we have a phenomenally complicated system of fault-free subduction zones and extensive crustal faulting. And a hazard disaggregation is performed, such as the scenarios which contribute the greatest to the hazard are weighted the highest, and so we work out the computational cost of what we want to compute and work out how many scenarios we're able to compute. Highly optimized new Tsunami codes, the Tsunami High C engine developed at the University of Malaga has been central to this, optimized for highly parallel GPU computing. And within the first phase project, we conducted about 2.5 million simulations of high resolution inundation before the outputs and integration. It's a quick overview of the kind of improvements at both ends at the source level, considering more complicated slip models and more realistic depth dependent sources with formalism for how we generate slip models. Improved coverage for the output metrics globally with coastlines not previously considered in the global model. The idea is that the user will have control of the scale and the hazard levels considered, such that for a given coastline of interest, you will get hazard curves where the user can specify the return period needed with the uncertainty level required, and then can be used to generate evacuation maps and hazard risk products. This has already been applied to Italy for the Italian coastal protection authorities. So we see the red and orange regions are evacuation zones with different parameters which are defined geometrically. And compared with the output from the probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment for different confidence levels with the blue curves. So in the top we see PTHA result, I've forgotten which confidence level. And at the bottom is a worst case scenario. We see that this corresponds quite well with the bounds, but the authorities can decide which is the more relevant metric to use with that. Through the Aristotle project, which is another commercial project, the output from the tsunami simulations and the inundation are being combined with exposure information, which can to return very rapid numbers. This is a project that I'm personally involved with, so I will have to forward you to other people to explain this, but it's a demonstration that the model is actively in use already. To put it together, the idea is that the improved hazard products we will generally will improve the risk products too, and all the so whether it's from global to local scaling or with different design demands and metrics. We hope that the new global hazard model will help greatly. Going back to Ian Behrens's paper, which has been discussed on several occasions at this meeting already, there are knowledge gaps in source representation and the modelling of hazard intensity, which I purposely made these all a bit too small, so we don't have to go through each of them. But want to recognise two things. Firstly, in the 3 years since this paper was produced, many of these knowledge gaps are already being advanced with a lot more knowledge. And we also have an appreciation that things that are knowledge gaps from a global perspective are very well addressed for other parts of the world, such as Cascadia. So Cascadia is mapped out to an unprecedented high degree compared to many other global services. There are also knowledge gaps in the vulnerability and risk, in exposure modelling, in physical vulnerability models, gaps in risk and resilience metrics, and gaps in social vulnerability, multidimensional vulnerability and risk indicators. We picked out just a few, but these have already been discussed in quite a lot of depth yesterday. But limitations into understanding of physical vulnerability, so which require improved models of structural response, etc. Limited overview of the social impact and capacity for understanding risk will affect the effectiveness of risk mitigation measures. Limitations in understanding human exposure and risk to tsunami inundation. Limited understanding of cascading impacts of tsunamis and societal resilience. And again, this is something which will be very well understood regionally and in some locations and less well appreciated globally. So just to conclude, the global tsunami model is now formally and very recently established as a legal entity. The main objective is to reduce losses from tsunamis. The first technical priority for GMT is a robust, updatable and scalable and flexible global probabilistic hazard model. This needs to be interoperable with existing hazard products, so to propagate this into good risk products. We're taking small but important steps now towards implementing the hazard products we've developed, for example, evacuation maps, rapid response analysis, loss modelling and vulnerability and risk analysis. But it is vital to have the risk community on board in this. We need to know what you need best. The better the hazard products, the better the risk products will be. And so we need feedback so that we can refine and improve on what we deliver, speaking from the hazard end. Thank you.
One quick question.
So you mentioned, you've been focusing a lot in, the EU. And so I'm wondering, as you expand outside of the EU, are you going to be using like the GEM model where they incorporate the local and regional sources of data so that, they're consistent, that kind of thing?
Yes, we want the global model to be as flexible as possible to different models. We appreciate the limitations and we want to be able to apply that to very specialized and specific hazard models or globally. So we want this to be made as flexible and scalable as possible.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I have 20 minutes? Okay, and somebody's taking notes? Excellent, okay. There's a decent chance there'll be questions that I can't answer, so. Right. And I think I'll leave this up here, because otherwise I'll wander around too much, but we'll see. Right, so anyway, I'm Kara Jacobacci, I'm here representing FEMA. I feel a little unprepared for this presentation, to be honest, because I'm actually not a tsunami scientist. I am a geologist, but my background's in landslides. Since I started with FEMA just under 3 years ago, I have been pulled into the tsunami world to support the earthquake program managers in my region. So some of you may have met Hannah Rabinowitz. She would be your primary contact for most things earthquake and tsunami, and I'm the support person. She'll be coming back in January from maternity leave. So, I mean, it worked out that I got to go to American Samoa, so I'm not complaining. Yeah, I was just like, oh, you're having a kid? So, anyway, I'm gonna have some notes up here. A lot of you have been along with me on this journey to improve FEMA's National Risk Index when it comes to tsunami. So if I'm misstating anything, please let me know. There have been, I don't even know how many hours of meetings between FEMA and various states and territories just to improve the tsunami module of the National Risk Index, which I will see is, am I losing my presentation here? Oh,
No technical issue.
Oh, okay.
I have it on my laptop.
I can just spam on a topic, don't worry about it. It's one of 18 hazards in the national risk. So one of the challenges I've realized working at a federal level is we all are we think our little hazard is like super important, and it is. I feel the same way about landslides. I'm like, nobody cares about these enough, and you're not like, worried enough about them. But when you have to deal with things across an entire nation, especially such a geographically large nation, the individual pieces tend to kind of get painted over with a broad brush. That's the way that I would describe it. So how many of you are familiar with the National Risk Index? Okay, so about half the room. Okay, so I won't go too deep into it. I'll just give a brief overview. And for those of you who don't know, too, FEMA is divided into 10 regions geographically, and then there's also headquarters, which is the DC area. And those people usually do projects that would be relevant for the entire nation. I'm in Region 10, so I'm representing Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. So that's just the way it's kind of laid out. So for a lot of you, you might have a different regional earthquake program manager, but of course I can get you in touch with them. So the National Risk Index was originally created as a way to try to quantify risk geographically, where are your most vulnerable areas to this hazard or this hazard? Where is the community vulnerable but more resilient to it for whatever reason, whether it has to do with economic reasons. And because everything has to be turned into dollars, it's all risk indices, which is a really different way of thinking about risk than what I'm used to. I'm used to life safety. So you plan for the worst case scenario, and that's your life safety. That's what you want to have for your evacuation maps and everything. It gets much more complicated when you have to try to integrate that into average annualized losses, because that's what FEMA likes to deal with. Those of you who have used HAZIS You've seen the outputs from houses, they're very economic focused, which I also was very alien to me when I first started working there. I mean, they even have a statistical value of a human life. There's a dollar amount on your lives. A little macabre, but that's the way it is. That's the only common denominator. So the National Risk Index was a stab at quantifying, you know, which areas are going to be the most at risk, and then they subdivided it out by 18 hazards. So there's like a composite score, which is supposed to tell you out of all the hazards in the National Risk Index, these are going to be the ones that, you know, these areas in the country are the most vulnerable overall. And then for each hazard, you have, you know, different categories. As you can imagine, the entire interior is not being shown at risk to tsunamis because it's the interior. So going from that large composite down to the individual hazards is where a lot of the criticism for the National Risk Index has come. Because again, you're overgeneralizing things, and it's meant to be looked at from maybe a statewide level and less so for like a community or census tract, even though the display on the map actually goes down to the census tract level. So let's see, I'm trying to see if I'm getting off on a tangent here. Okay, one of the big things I want to point out too is, again, from a federal standpoint, we're worried about every disaster, right? It's floods, it's drought, it's hail, it's tornadoes. Several of those 18 hazards in the list happen yearly, like hurricanes. Every year, somebody gets hit with a hurricane. Every year, there's some tornadoes in the Midwest. And it's been really difficult for the way that the modelers, who are, I would say, largely more mathematical and method focused and not individual science people, to take what they've designed for hurricanes and, you know, average annualized losses for hurricanes and how many dollars does it cost us per year, and extrapolate that out to something like tsunami, where we haven't had the big one in recent memory, in recent history. That's one of the biggest challenges. It's just we haven't had a Cascadia event since 1700, and we don't know, you know, exactly what the impacts were. So the original iteration of the okay. Got it. Okay, so yeah, there we go. Expected annual loss, that's your bottom line right there. So everything's got to be turned into, oh, this is a confusing pointer. Everything's got to be turned into this. Very different from the way I like to think about it. So this is gonna keep happening. Oh no, okay. So we had, you know, math with letters, and now we have math with words, which is probably worse. But I did want to throw some formulas up in here, and please don't ask me to go into detail about them. I'm gonna have to refer you to the technical documentation, which I think is 400 pages long. I have read it, but not much of it sticks. But the general idea is that, you know, by county, you get this, you know, estimated annual loss, you get a score, you get a score, you get a score, and then the composite of all of that is your risk. Now, when you are all working in your individual communities, you kind of know where the risk is. Like, you know, I live in Washington, we know that Grace Harbor is at risk. But when you're doing this on a national level and you're not familiar with, you know, every single state and then the geologic hazards or the hazards within that state, it's a lot harder to know right off the bat if you're getting, you know, data that's coming out kind of funny. Now, the NRI was supposedly developed with the help of experts. I know Nate Wood from USGS has been heavily involved, and he's been a huge help in making improvements to the tsunami process. But I don't know the whole history. So I don't know to what level, you know, academia was involved, et cetera. The other kind of challenging thing is, I think sometimes they're told, make a widget, and, you know, Congress wants a widget. You got 4 months, you got to make it, take a stab at it, and, you know, see what happens. And just for an example, I've been providing feedback on the landslide section, which is going to also be getting a revamp. And they basically told the contract modeler, here's a bunch of variables, make soup out of it and make it worthwhile. So we took a stab at it, and it was pretty good. But, you know, when you get an expert in there, they're like, oh no, like this is a wrong assumption, this is a wrong assumption, but you need that subject matter expertise to help, which is something that we have not had. FEMA doesn't have a tsunami program at all. There's no dedicated funding for it. It's rolled into the earthquake program just a little bit. And I think every region has an earthquake program manager, which is kind of interesting within itself when you think about, like, you know, like Maine and Massachusetts having an earthquake program manager, but they do. But The tsunami work is not even like, it's not even really part of the job description in a lot of cases. And sometimes it's rolled into a completely different position. They might not work in the same sub-branch. I mean, it's very confusing. So there's a really big disconnect. One thing I've noticed in interacting with a lot of non-science people is that they don't really, they think of these as discrete events, but they don't really think about cascading hazards. So like we've talked about, you can have an earthquake and that can generate a tsunami. You can have a landslide, that can generate a tsunami. You can have an earthquake that generates a landslide that then generates a tsunami. It's that stringing them all together that seems to also pose some issues when you're trying to, again, turn them into, you know, a single number per year of dollar losses, for example. We haven't come up with a good way to deal with the interconnectivity of these hazards and then also, you know, come up with a recurrence interval that is reasonable and not overly conservative and, you know, can be used for the type of index that they want to create. So this is just a little graphic showing these were, it's driving me crazy. Okay. These are the original inputs, and I will tell you that the original tsunami data input was NOAA's historical run-up data, which only goes back to 1800. So all of you can see what's wrong with that. It's one of those things that I think if maybe they had a subject matter expert intervene earlier, they could have been like, no, like that's not an okay data set to use. They overlaid that with inundation maps made by the states. That part is good. Take the state's data. They know what they're doing. They know their communities better, but you can't look at 221 years worth of tsunami points and say that accurately represents our hazard in America. We just, you know, we haven't had that happen yet. So I think these are these slides getting passed out? I think, are they getting distributed?
Yeah,
Okay.
you agree to it, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this table I know is hard to read, but it just shows you where the original source data was from. And one of the biggest things with this was that they had to start with data that was national, which we don't have really good data for a lot of hazards at the national level. It's really hard to do. And there's minor variances and like, you know, when I did landslide mapping, we did points and polygons and a separate polygon for the scarp and flank and a polyline for the scarp. Other states make it one big polygon. So all of those little differences in how the data is actually created makes it really hard to integrate it into a national data set. You also want to, you know, you don't want to introduce any bias. So this is something that I know Maximilian Dixon has been very vocal about, is that we should be using better data from the states, which is true because the states generally have the most accurate and up-to-date data. The counter argument I've heard to that is that you can inadvertently introduce bias when you have a couple of states with really, really good data that they've put a lot of effort in. And then you have a couple states that are just, you know, they haven't gotten to that point yet. Like we don't even have recurrence intervals for Alaska at the moment. Or ones that they felt comfortable putting into the National Risk Index. So that's kind of the challenge. And I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, both of them are not really great choices. You don't want to introduce bias into a tool that's going to be used to determine where money goes, which Karina alluded to yesterday, which I'll hopefully get to if I haven't gone over my time already. How much time do I have left, by the way?
I've stopped counting because of
Oh.
technical difficulties.
Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna keep you here.
I hope that's okay.
So, yeah, and that's the fallout from it, is that if you're going to use something like this as a tool to determine who is being prioritized for funding, you have to be really careful about the data that goes into it and then the information that comes out of it. And make sure that you're not accidentally introducing bias or you're not, you know, over or under counting hazard. Let's see. So this is the first iteration. Now this is getting updated thanks to tons of work by the states, the territories, the headquarters team. Unfortunately, Annie's deployed at the moment for Hurricane Milton. And Casey, I think there's a moratorium on travel from headquarters, so they couldn't be here. I would prefer to let them explain, you know, all the work that they've done. But this is the, you know, first iteration of it. You know, what is this relatively moderate? And then, you know, Clallam, and then right under it, relatively low? That's not true. We know that's wrong, you know? What is this? You know, why is this one county up here relatively high? But again, when this went to be published, this is one of 18 hazards. They didn't go through, each one individually to do a ton of, you know, spot checking. I will say, one thing that we were able to get corrected, right after the 2022 summer NTHMP, these were all, the whole Gulf Coast and East Coast was listed as not applicable. And we got them to change it to insufficient data, so that at least it doesn't give you the concept that it's safe, you know? So the team has been super receptive to feedback. They're trying to do a lot with a pretty limited number of staff. And because this is the federal government, as you can imagine, every time you update something, there's a lot of review and red tape and all the documentation that has to be done because it has to be repeatable and defendable and Freedom of Information Act requested and all of that. And I didn't want to leave out Alaska and Hawaii. In the current iteration of the National Risk Index, the territories here have insufficient data, but that's getting changed. They'll be included in the next update, which is supposed to come out by the end of the year. Again, the hurricanes have kind of put a bit of a damper. We're supposed to get the new HAZIS version. Not 100% sure if we're on track with that, but what can you do natural disasters, you know? But I mean, same thing here, just by looking at it, you know, even with my somewhat limited tsunami knowledge, I'm like, well, this makes no sense. You know, like, why is this one blue and this one's yellow, you know? And then why aren't they at least close? But again, when you're using historical run-up points, tsunami probably hit here and they had a point and somebody recorded it and it probably hit here and nobody wrote it down. So, you know, what do you do with that? So I will say, so yesterday we talked about how some of the building data is actually better at like larger aggregation sizes. Like it's a little wonky when you look at it on like a building by building. But if you like look at it as like the whole town of Seaside or Newport, you're like, okay, it's pretty close. You know, maybe some of the building, you know, information is a little bit off, but it's relatively close to what we would expect. This is actually kind of the inverse. I added this slide in like at the last second because I was tooling around with this. And if you look at Clallam up here, you know, it's in the relatively moderate or relatively low. I actually can't tell because the colors are so similar. Another, you know, feedback is to make these, you know, these, and I'm not colorblind. But you can see here, you're like, well, it's not relatively moderate, it's high. We know that Clallam County is in danger of a Cascadia tsunami. I think they're in danger of one coming down from Alaska, you know. This is one of our biggest risk areas. But when you zoom in on the census tract, now you're seeing the data that you're expecting to see, which is the bright red for these two parcels. Now, why this one is bright red and this one is in the relatively low category, don't know. But this is at least closer to what you expected. So we're actually having the inverse issue here, where when you average these out over the entire county, it's in some cases like downgrading the hazard, but then when you zoom in closer and closer and closer, you're like, oh yeah, there's the problem that I was expecting to see. Now, is this a useful tool in this, you know, in this iteration? Not really. And one of the other challenging things is when you think about what you make tools for, and I believe that's something that, you know, we've kind of been talking about a lot at this conference, like there's been tons of research on like, what's the correct wave arrival time? This is a whole big question that you're trying to answer. Is there a mega thrust or mega splay fault underneath Cascadia, or is it divided into 3 segments? These are all questions that we're trying to answer. But when it comes to like emergency management, they want the bottom line and they don't want that uncertainty. So it's been difficult even to integrate like academic research in with some of this, because in academia, you're like, well, I can tell you within some error bars that we think it's this, but like with these this list of caveats to be safe. And they're like, okay, but do I evacuate people or not? Do we put, you know, do we pay to put sirens up here or not, you know? And it's just, I don't know how to reconcile the two. This is something that I've struggled with throughout my whole employment, you know, it's 2 tools for 2 different things. You're trying to get dollar losses out of one for like planning scenarios. And then you're trying to do life safety with most of the tools that I would say you all create when you do evacuation maps and everything and walk maps. That's life safety. That's not getting you dollars, but that's getting you the life safety component. So I think what would be better is if, you know, we had tools like this that maybe weren't displayed to the public and maybe they were available to users who had to read through documentation that said, this is the limitations of this tool. It should not be used, you know, somebody in Clallam County shouldn't be like, oh, I'm in relatively low, I don't need to worry about tsunamis. That's what we don't want. That's what we don't want to happen. And unfortunately, when a lot of these tools then go public, that nuance is lost in the way it's socialized to the public, the way it's socialized to community leaders. And again, it's because a lot of times in emergency management, you don't have time for the details. They just, they want answers. They want you to tell them yes, no, because time is always, ticking. And unfortunately, tsunamis are competing with a lot of other hazards that happen every year. I mean, I've had conversations with community officials who are like, our town's gonna catch on fire in the next 5 years or something. Like, we have a limited bucket of civic money to deal with this, or we have flooding problems. We need to badly replace this culvert. Shouldn't we spend the money on that first? And I don't have an answer for that, It's like, if Cascadia happens and Grace Harbor hasn't been prepared, it's gonna be really bad. But if they need to spend the money to, there's a road that's eroding at the bottom of Grace Harbor County and they're about to lose some of their, I think, freshwater storage areas or something in the next 5 years, that's, that might be a more pressing need, and there just isn't a good answer to this. So I will say, on behalf of the headquarters team, this is what they've been working on so far. So yay, we have accomplished goal 1 here. Actually, I should face this way for a little while. I've been facing this way a lot. So I will say that after NTHMP raised objections, there were some letters sent, including one from the Commissioner of Public Lands in Washington, that helped get the attention of headquarters people. So that was actually very helpful. And that was a way that many of you helped support those of us in the region who are like, hey, this is kind of a problem. When they get an official letter on letterhead, somebody looks at it and pays attention, and it might have a little more impact than just, like myself and Hannah being like, this is a problem that we need to work on, So luckily with the impetus that the last couple of NTHMPs have given us, they did make some improvements, specifically the tsunami methodology. So 1 out of 18 hazards, they've improved it. Yay. It's taken a while, unfortunately, but they had to rerun a whole bunch of evacuation things. They did a ton of HAZUS runs. And a big difference is that that national structures inventory, which was mentioned yesterday, that's become available, and it's decent. It's better than what was there before, which has really helped with the analysis. And I will add too another area where like sort of the more life safety academic focus and then like the emergency management risk thing differs is we have a really big issue with protecting personally identifiable information, or PII. One of the biggest issues with like the HAZUS tsunami module is it wants to use the scattershot points. So randomized points in a census block, like there are 5 buildings in this block, but we're not going to put them exactly where they are for privacy reasons. We're going to just place 5 buildings in this block. That matters for flooding and for tsunami. The actual physical location down to, a couple of meters or feet really matters. And that was something that, again, when you're dealing with people who are used to modeling stuff on the scale of earthquakes, the shaking is going to be more or less pretty similar here and over there. But for a tsunami, you might get a completely different flow velocity. And it could, different debris patterns, tons of other things. So I think a lot of this was just some of the people developing this, they're not experts in this field. They didn't know that these were considerations. These are nuances that those of us who have specialized in this have learned over the years. So many of you have been involved in this. This update's coming out very soon, hopefully this year with the, the hurricane situation. The next phase is that, for those of you who use HAZUS, the tsunami module doesn't work outside of certain areas. It's just not programmed for that. They want to expand that. How many HAZUS people do we have in here? I did see it mentioned in a couple presentations. Got a couple, a little bit. Okay, a little handful. HAZUS 7 is supposed to be coming out, which will run on ArcGIS Pro. Stay tuned for that. Should be faster, hopefully be better. Don't know too many details, because again, the development's been kind of, I think, slowed down a little bit. All right. So just for those who are not super familiar with the way that, HAZUS analysis is done, the team does, level 1, 2, or 3 analysis, with 3 being the best, depending on how much data you have. And it spits out, economic losses and casualties and all of this other information, which is exactly what an index like the National Risk Index wants, average annualized losses. So, yeah, so building loss, population loss, this is what I was getting at with the value of a statistical life, a little macabre, but they gotta turn everything into dollars to make it comparable across the entire country. And unfortunately, I don't have a slide on the community disaster resilience zones or CDRZ or CEDARS. I wanted to add one yesterday and my computer stopped letting me log in around 3:30. So I will just have to talk to you about it. So that was the other part that Karina was alluding to yesterday, was after the NRI was developed and it was in its existence, and it's like, well, it's out there, you can use it if you want, you can, you know, or ignore it, doesn't matter. There was a bipartisan supported bill for establishing these community disaster resilience zones where basically they would be considered a priority for funding. And I think what I've heard, and I can't say if this is categorically true or not, is basically, you know, the bill was drafted and then it was like, you have 4 months to select these areas, get it done. How do you integrate climate justice, economic, all of this in 4 months and make sure that you're making the right decision? You know, that's a huge ask. It could take, you could study years of economic data and still not have a great answer for which are the most vulnerable areas in a given state, because it can also depending on the way you describe vulnerability. So that's the other main controversy with this, is that the CEDARS, the community disaster resilience zones, were developed, they were published, and they don't make a lot of sense. What I've heard from people who live in the States, and I can say that I'm from New Jersey, so I went on and looked at the ones that were flagged in New Jersey, and there's like 2 random parcels in a city called Moonachie, which is in the county I grew up. Wouldn't really call them disadvantaged, so I have no idea what composite of those indices flagged them as a disadvantaged community. But again, if you don't have a person there from every single state going, yes, that's reasonable, no, that's not reasonable, you have no way of knowing whether what you've produced is, you know, is even correct. So there's been a lot of negative press about it. My coworker Casey had a really uncomfortable interview that some of you may have seen, where he had to, you know, kind of defend this, and they're trying to make it better. There's another CEDARS update supposed to be coming out later this year, where they're going to integrate the tribes, which they didn't do the first time around, and the territories, which they didn't have in the first iteration. And they're supposed to be improving the methodology. I just got an email like 20 minutes ago about a listening session that had happened where they had come up with, you know, like, what do you guys think about the CEDARS? What's wrong with it? And one of the biggest things was that the national level data sets don't really get at the nitty gritty of the issues in a specific area. They can't be used. 1 minute, okay. So yeah, so these are the works in progress. Update to the, you know, National Risk Index. Oh, I didn't mention the PTHA, okay. So really quick, Region 10 is actually funding Alex and Dan Ungard to do some PTHA analysis through our CTP grant, which is really exciting. That'll be taking place over the next 3 years, and they're going to be, I believe, using the logic tree methodology that's been largely discussed here. Independently of that, FEMA headquarters has engineers, and these are, I think, more engineering engineers, not like geoscience engineers, who are following Pat Lynette's method, which I'm not super familiar with, but it's Pat Lynette's idea, where they're developing this transfer function. And unfortunately, again, Betsy couldn't be here today to explain it to you, so if you have detailed questions about this, you can get my email and I will forward it to her, because I don't know. But so we're kind of developing this PTHA alongside of it, with the idea seeing that eventually Alex and Dan will see how their results match up with what FEMA headquarters is doing. They still want to work on it, so they're working on it, and maybe between the two, we'll come up with a really great PTHA methodology, but TBD on that, it's still in its infancy. So yeah, Tsunami investments, and then I do want to put contact info up here. I will be here until about 10 to 4, then I've got to go to the train station, but get a business card for me if I didn't answer a question that you have. This was kind of a rushed presentation, so I'm happy to talk to you more about it later, or forward you to somebody who might be more of an expert than I am, depending on the question. And I think I'll end there.
One quick question for Kara, and thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah, that's okay.
There always has to be at least one AV up.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't mind just standing up here and yapping, so.
Yes.
Oh, let me bring the microphone over there.
Thank you. My quick question was, so FEMA has a program of NFIP, which is using risk rating. And so I was wondering if NFIP is also informing the NRI, or are they talking to each other in some ways?
That's a good question.
Can you say what NFIP is for those?
Yeah, so NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program. So I believe, we had a discussion before about the 100-year flood versus the 500-year flood. That's the regulatory thing. I would actually have to check the documentation for the flood specific module. I basically spent all my time reading the tsunami and landslide one, but I would imagine yes. They're also gonna probably use historic flood data, which we actually, for floods, we have a decent amount of that cataloged over the last 200 years, high water marks, et cetera. So it's probably informing it to some extent, but when it comes to the regulatory component of it, whether you can build here or you have to buy flood insurance or not, that's risk map. That's its own thing. It does not integrate the NRI. It has its own 8-year process with HECRES, detailed engineering modules, and all of this kind of stuff that goes into it. So not for regulatory, but maybe for a top-down view.
With that, you're up, I keep.
Oh.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ankit. I'm representing Aon today. And so my role within Aon is sitting within the reinsurance division of the company. And our role, our day-to-day is basically advising insurance companies on how to manage their risk through the use of catastrophe loss models. I'm an engineer by training, and my background is in earthquake engineering and statistics. And my day-to-day really involves looking at multiple catastrophe loss models out there. And we break down the loss models into the hazard component, the vulnerability component, and study how the different components are interplaying with each other to create the final economic and the financial loss. And just trying to make sense whether that represents an accurate view of risk for an insurance company or not. So shout out to my colleagues. I talk to multiple people within my organization to gather views of different executives on how they have dealt with tsunami and tsunami insurance through the course of the years. So this is how I usually like to communicate this earthquake and tsunami risk to our audiences or to executives who are sitting at the point where they're involved in more and more of decision making. The first thing, I don't think I need to elaborate to this group that where is the earthquake risk highest in this country. But the second point where I really like to drill down upon is the earthquake protection gap. We have noticed that earthquake protection gap is very significant, even in the high seismic regions, just because of the low awareness of the threat posed by the earthquakes, and really a lack of recent loss causing significant damaging events in the recent past. The last earthquake was in 1994, which was a significant loss causing damaging event, the Northridge event. And the last tsunami was back in 1700, like a significant tsunami event. So all of this leads to a recency bias, and people tend to forget what might happen in the future. And another detriment towards the insurance is the cost. No one is excited about buying another insurance policy, right? So that's another major deterrent towards the earthquake protection gap, which we have noticed. The third thing I want to point out today is when we talk about these different loss models, which are available in the market, they're usually sold as earthquake loss models. And we have tsunami, liquefaction, fire following, and sprinkler leakage. All of those perils are technically called as sub-perils, are also embedded in those earthquake loss models, and it's an option to run them. So you can run shake, and there's an option to turn on and off tsunami in case you're interested. But it's important to know and communicate that depending on where you are, where your risk is, those sub-perils can actually lead to more significant losses or comparable significant losses to earthquakes as well. And the last point is on this slide is, I think, the enforcement of building codes. It's super important because we know that the communities which are more resilient have been retrofitted, have been adopting and implementing the latest building codes. And it's important to keep that work going. An example which comes to mind is the recent Turkey earthquakes. They have a very excellent seismic engineering community. They have excellent building codes, but unfortunately, they didn't have the best of enforcement on the ground. So I think having good in building codes is good. Enforcement and adoption of those building codes on the ground is also very important. So this is the structure of my talk today. I know I'm the last person standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to keep it compact and crisp. So first I'll talk about the economic and insured losses from the recent events involving tsunami. And then I'll highlight learnings from the recent events which involve tsunami. And then finally talk about the tsunami insurance seen in the United States market, how our tsunami insurance policy is structured, and in case of a damage due to earthquake or tsunami, who is responsible for paying what. And of course, last part of the questions and discussion, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. So first section is talking about the economic and the insured losses from the recent events which were involving tsunami. We talked a lot about these events yesterday, and the three major events which I like to highlight here is the first one is the Tohoku earthquake in Japan in 2011. It had about $330 billion of economic loss. And please keep in mind that all of these numbers are combined earthquake and tsunami losses, and they have been inflated to the current US dollar. So in the Tohoku earthquake, we had an economic loss of $330 billion US. And what I'd like to add more color to this workshop is looking at the insured loss. The insured loss was $50 billion. So what I want to highlight here is the difference between the insured and the economic loss. Only 15% of the loss was actually insured. So that means 85% of the economic loss caused in the earthquake had no insurance. In the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which was the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, very well talked about in the workshop as well. The economic loss total was about $31 billion US. And again, the insured loss was about $4 billion US, which is 10% of the total economic loss. So again, what I want to emphasize again here is the protection gap. So the protection gap is the amount of insurance which was actually required versus the amount of insurance which is actually purchased by the community. So we are again seeing roughly 10% of the economic losses have been covered. So there is a large protection gap in which we saw in these events. In the Indonesia earthquake in 2018, again, a big loss causing event. It had $2 billion of economic loss. And again, the insured losses are $98 million US. So about 5% of the economic losses were actually insured by the insurance companies. Now, this makes you think, is tsunami insurance not available here? Is there, what is causing this large protection gap? So I went to a bit of exploration mode and figured out that the low penetration of tsunami insurance was actually not due to the availability of tsunami insurance. It was actually due to the awareness as well as the fact that people didn't really purchase tsunami insurance. So the text here highlights that for the buildings, contents, as well as the business interruption damage, tsunami coverage is added as automatic inclusion with your earthquake or flood coverage, which in turn is a voluntary addition to your fire coverage. So let me make it a little more simple. So if you have purchased fire insurance, and if you have take the option of earthquake or flood, you will get tsunami insurance as covered. Now, what we found out that a lot of the large commercial companies in the areas which was impacted by tsunami, only a small proportion of these commercial big industries were going and purchasing fire insurance. And then, so if you don't have fire, you don't have earthquake, you don't have tsunami. So it's like a cascading effect. And residential properties, which are usually backed by government-backed mortgages, they usually require you to purchase some kind of insurance. If they had that regulation, if they had that compulsion to purchase it, they did. But we did notice that a lot of the people didn't purchase fire insurance in the first place. So ultimately, they didn't have the option of being included as a part of the tsunami coverage. Here's an article here which also reflects the same point that this was a significant event. This was a $330 billion event, but the hit to the insurance and the reinsurance industry was not significant at all, just because of the low penetration of the tsunami insurance. So my brief comment here is this requires attention both on the public, private sector, and we need to mind the interface between the public and the private sector as well and work together to close this gap, to increase the awareness so that this protection gap is more closed. Just because we have historically observed that people with insurance usually recover fast and in a better way than people who don't. So it's really important in workshops like these to have these conversations to increase the awareness so we can close the gap and more people can have access to insurance. They have access, more people have awareness to purchase this insurance in the first place. Next up is learnings from the recent major events involving tsunami. Here I would like to primarily focus on the Tohoku event because it was a recent major event which had a lot of learnings for the scientific community as well as the community in the industry as well. There are two major components which changed after Tohoku, and the good thing is it led to a significant reduction of tsunami risk. What's the challenge? I'll talk about that in the next slide, but let's talk about the good part. The good part is improved tsunami defenses. There was a substantial improvement to the tsunami defenses. Seawalls up to 15-meter height were built in some areas. And we talked a lot about the evacuation facilities in this workshop as well. So all of these, a lot of the places were enhanced with the building of evacuation facilities in very low-lying tsunami-exposed areas. And another important aspect is the demographic change. A lot of people moved out of the impacted areas due to tsunami, and studies show that there was an up to a 33% reduction in the impacted areas due to the tsunami. So this leads to a significant reduction in population as well as exposure. Now, you'd like to think that this is good because it's leading to a significant reduction in the tsunami risk. But there's a caveat. Are those catastrophe loss models being updated fast enough so that they can absorb these changes to exposure as well as the complete landscape so that the loss estimates coming out of those models are actually reflecting the truth? What I mean to say is if you look at the figure on the left, which is the March 2009 figure, this land was predominantly used for residential and farming purposes, and houses were along the low-lying coastal region as well. So if you model something right here, and a few years later, you have the complete landscape, which has completely shifted with upgraded seawalls, the question is, are our models being updated quickly enough to absorb these changes? And so that we can reflect those insured loss estimates or even ground up loss estimates in a more accurate way. The devastation again was significant in the 2011 tsunami. We saw low seawalls which were completely destroyed by it, and the residential area was also completely devastated. Very unfortunate. And when we talked to our colleagues in Japan, they said that this is actually one of the major limitations of the catastrophe loss models there, that they are not being updated fast enough, if I were to use that term, to absorb these changes in the landscape as well as the demography. So it's important for us going forward to make sure that we are aligned in a way that we are absorbing these changes to reflect in our models. The last section of my talk is based on the tsunami insurance and how the tsunami policies are structured in the United States, and what is the data feeding into the models, which is being used to calculate the tsunami insurance rates, as well as the gaps and how we can improve it. So tsunami insurance in the United States is provided under the flood insurance policies. If you think you have an earthquake policy and you're covered for tsunami, you're not. The largest carrier of earthquake policies in California Earthquake Authority, does not provide you tsunami insurance. So you have to go through FEMA, which has a very nice National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, or you can go through the route of the private flood insurance market, which usually offers you more flexibility as compared to NFIP, and it offers you more range of deductibles as well. It's important to note that this is a feature unique to us in the United States. If you look at other countries, like, for example, I was working on a client project for a client in Chile, and in Chile, they have tsunami insurance under the earthquake coverage policies. So it's a little unintuitive because tsunami is an event caused by earthquakes, but the coverage is actually under flood. Another important point I would like to add here is if you have a home which is in a high-risk flood zone, and it is backed by a federally backed mortgage, you are required to purchase flood insurance. And if you have flood insurance, you'll all automatically be covered for tsunami. So that's the good news. So here's a slide on FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, and NFIP. I don't want to speak for FEMA, but I think it's important to highlight in this space. But it was the policy was formed in 1968 and has evolved since then. And it is the maximum coverage offered by NFIP is capped through an act of Congress. So you have a limit of $250,000 for building coverage and $100,000 for contents. Now, what would you do if you are interested in purchasing more coverage? You can go to a private flood insurance carrier who will offer you more options for additional coverages. The deductible offered by the NFIP policies is set at a fixed price of $2,500. And like I talked about a short while ago, it has a limited coverage, but it has a very good and a sound actuarial process which goes through it, which determines the insurance rates. Like I pointed a little bit earlier, this policy is based on 1 minute. I'll make it work. It's based on the risk rating programs, and this risk rating programs is basically using a lot of data from MDI model, which is based on the Geophysics Australia data, as well as the Verisk earthquake model for the United States. And they're trying to come up with accurate rates as possible. The last update to this program was in 2021, and the insurance rates were capped at an increase of 18%. And what it means in terms of dollars was, none of the homeowners saw an increase of more than $20 per month, which I feel is reasonable considering the actuarial process going behind this is quite sound. So since I'm running a little short on time, I just wanted to let you know that there's also the private flood insurance market, which has at least as broad as coverage as FEMA with additional options. So you have more deductibles, you can purchase additional coverage, and it is also based on data intensive models. So another brief description for the NFIP policy is all the science which is being discussed in this room, as well as the models which are being continuously updated, they feed into the risk rating programs, and all of these insurance rates are highly sensitive to all of the premiums which are being calculated by the NFIP process. And I just want to highlight here that at this moment, Verisk is the only catastrophe model out there with a probabilistic tsunami solution. And there are potential gaps in that solution as well. When you go into the risk rating 2.0 methodology, you realize that a lot of locations within that process were removed because they saw an overestimation in loss because of the resolution of the model. So it was based on a 132-meter grid, which was not sufficient to capture the tsunami risk. So what I want to say is there are potential gaps in the probabilistic solutions which can be addressed so that we can have more accurate actuarial rates as well. Risk rating 3.0 is coming up soon as well, and they plan to integrate the ASCE data, American Society of Civil Engineers, to better capture tsunami risk and come up with more accurate rates. So this is my, I think this is the last slide here. What I wanted to say is, when you talk to people who are facing the clients and talking to people about tsunami risk, they say that improved understanding of tsunami hazard, especially at a very fine resolution, is very key to understanding the tsunami process, the tsunami risk scene. Vulnerability is also important, and it comes into play, especially when you actuaries are looking at the whole process. It's very important for the soundness of your complete risk assessment process. Another requirement, another point which came up during the conversation was ability to view the tsunami or the flooding events in real time. It's a challenge, but it's discussed very widely within the community that can we do this? And high fidelity models are really important to capture the tsunami risk. The last comment here is different. So we have probabilistic models which can represent different things to different people, but it really depends on who you're talking to. So if you want a best estimate of a stochastic or an average annual loss, you want to avoid being over conservative. So there's an inclination towards being on a median or the average of the distribution. However, if you're talking to someone who's developing a risk product, who is who's trying to generate more revenue, they want to talk about the extremes. They want to look at the worst case scenarios, and there is an inclination to focus on those scenarios. So we have the solutions. So it's really up to us that how we are talking about the tsunami risk as well. And that's all for my talk today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Ankit. I'm not gonna prolong the session because there's lunch and we have a lot of time for discussion after lunch. But we have time for one question for Ankit and maybe a follow-up question for the entire panel.
Something that I hear a lot from our leadership, and I'm sure others hear it too, is a concern that when we release new modeling or new risk assessments that are showing, these houses are in a danger zone, or this is how many people we're expecting to be, casualties or fatalities of this event, that is going to scare insurers. And suddenly we're gonna have, all the insurers pull out of Washington's coast or all the realtors or something, that it's gonna cause this mass panic. I know that's not true, or I really hope it is, not true, but how would you speak to that concern?
So I can speak. So I can speak to that concern, first by looking at the NFIP policy. So when the underlying risk rating methodology is updated, let's say any amount of years, there's a cap. So the insurance rates can't go up by more than 18%. So then who pays for when there's excess loss? The taxpayers. That's when it gets a little ugly. But FEMA is restricting any increase in premiums more than 18%, which means that the losses, the increase is probably less than $20 per month. So that's one thing which is good. The second thing is I'm trying to think of the scenario here. So it's important to communicate the update and risk too, but you have to keep in mind that people don't want to pay more insurance. And some of the things like you've mentioned has happened in the past, like the 1994 Northridge earthquake. A lot of the insurance companies pulled out of the market just because they went bankrupt because they couldn't handle it. So California Earthquake Authority was formed after 1994 Northridge earthquake. So I feel like we are better prepared than before. And I think the policies, the insurance companies are also having something called as adequacy premium. So what they do through that exercise is they control the premium so that it's not being inflated too much. And so that's two things I can add to that conversation. Happy to take it offline too.
We appreciate that.
No worries.
I guess a follow-up or related comment to that is, I mean, in the case of climate change, we've got a moving target now, and things are happening more frequently, and we just only have to look at hurricane activity in the southeast and the insurance companies that are pulling out of Florida,
Yeah.
etc. So could we? It seems like this could become a problem.
It is. We are seeing that already. Last year, for severe convective storms, which are very prominent. So they're like, for Japan, there's earthquakes. For us, it's like severe convective storms. It's just because they're very low frequency, but the eventual economic loss is so high. So last year we had a loss of $50 billion, which was just insured due to severe convective storms. So a lot of these insurance companies, yes, are pulling out of the market. And because it's a tough business, right? FEMA's NFIP program, since its formation, they have spent about $60 billion in establishing the program, in collecting the premiums, and you would think, well, they're probably making a profit, but they have paid out $90 billion. So it's a very tricky situation, and yes, but through increased awareness of risk, I feel like, and I think something which I was discussing with Katsu as well, that through innovative ways of pricing those insurance premiums or policies so that they are more subsidized in case of very extreme events, there might be ways to make communities more resilient.
It's lunchtime. Okay, Ignacio, you get the organizing committee.
Oh,
Power.
I just wanted to have a comment about, super briefly, about non-stationarity. First of all, I want to repeat again the idea of someone, maybe it was you, I don't remember, but someone about trying to inform the probability. Because these events are so low recurrence that probably that is the main reason why people are not deciding to get covered for this kind of problem. And the second thing also is related with what you were saying about the the movement of the demographics, for example, the Japan, and I like to collect pictures from the past, from the 1960s, even for Crescent City, I started to get those pictures for the branding of the meeting, and you were seeing that people got far away.
Yeah.
That corner, there was a very important bank, and people just went to another place. There was a famous hotel, they disappeared and they moved it. But the thing is that it will pass some time, and people eventually will go back. My father, a couple of years ago, bought an apartment in the waterfront of La Serena in a place which was flooded a century ago, and people forgot, and they started to develop the buildings again in that area. So that picture that you were showing, probably 100 years more people will go back again. So, and that is another non-stationary process that we need to consider in this study. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Humans' naiveness is stationary.
Exactly.
Good point.
Okay, so we have lunch now, we'll reconvene at 1, you know.